When God chooses you, life begins to feel heavier. There is a moment in every believer's life when something shifts on the inside. You may not have words for it, but you feel it. A holy interruption, a quiet weight, a sense that God is no longer just inviting you to believe, but calling you to become. Being chosen by God is not a compliment. It is a summons. And when God chooses someone, life rarely stays comfortable, predictable, or small. The Bible never presents God's choosing as an easy upgrade. It is not applause. It is not instant clarity. It is not a smooth road lined with affirmation. When God chooses a person, He begins a work that reaches far deeper than behavior. He touches identity. He rearranges priorities. He disrupts patterns that once felt safe. And often the first sign of being chosen is not blessing. It is pressure. Many people desire to be chosen by God, but few understand what that truly means. Scripture shows us that when God chooses someone, things begin to happen that feel confusing, even painful at times. Relationships shift. Old comforts lose their grip. The way you see yourself begins to change. You may feel set apart without knowing why. You may feel stretched beyond what feels reasonable. And if you don't understand what's happening, you may assume something is wrong when in fact something sacred has begun. God does not choose people casually. He chooses with intention, with foresight, with purpose that reaches beyond one lifetime. And when His hand rests on a life, He begins shaping it in ways that are not always visible, but always meaningful. The choosing of God is never about status. It is about stewardship. It is not about privilege. It is about responsibility. And it always carries a cost. If you felt a growing tension between who you've been and who you sense God is calling you to be, you are not imagining it. If your faith has deepened while your comfort has decreased, you are not failing. If obedience has become more demanding, if surrender has become more personal, if trust has become more necessary, you may be experiencing what happens when God chooses someone. This message is not meant to elevate you. It is meant to prepare you, because understanding what happens when God chooses you brings peace to seasons that once felt confusing. It brings clarity to pressure that once felt unfair. And it reminds you that what God is doing in you right now may be far more significant than what you see around you. Number one, God separates you before He elevates you. One of the first and most misunderstood things that happens when God chooses you is separation. Not isolation for punishment, but separation for preparation. When God sets His hand on a life, He begins by gently and sometimes painfully pulling that person away from what once felt familiar. Old patterns no longer satisfy. Certain conversations feel empty. Environments you once thrived in suddenly feel heavy, and without realizing it, you find yourself standing between what was and what is not yet. This separation is not God pushing you away from people, it is God pulling you closer to Himself. Scripture shows this pattern again and again. Abraham was called to leave his country and his father's house before God ever showed him the land. Moses was taken from the palace and placed in the wilderness long before he led Israel. Jeremiah was set apart before he was even born. God separates before He elevates, because elevation without separation leads to pride, confusion, and collapse. Separation feels lonely because it strips away false support systems. God removes crutches so you learn to lean on Him. He quiets distractions so you can hear His voice. He limits access so your dependency shifts. This is not abandonment, it is refinement. God is teaching you that your identity is not rooted in people, approval, or familiarity, but in Him alone. Many people mistake this season as loss, but Scripture reveals it as pruning. Jesus said, "The Father cuts away branches not to harm the vine, but to make it more fruitful." What feels like subtraction is often preparation for multiplication. God is creating space in your life for what He intends to bring next. If you feel misunderstood, alone, or out of place, do not rush to escape it. Ask what God is forming. Separation hurts because it exposes attachment, but it also reveals calling. And those God elevates without separating often fall. But those He separates first are strengthened to stand. Number two, God allows pressure to reveal what He placed inside you. After separation often comes pressure, not random pressure, but purposeful pressure. When God chooses you, He allows circumstances that stretch you beyond comfort, control, and self-reliance. Pressure is not a sign that God is against you. It is often evidence that God is working deeply within you. Scripture is clear that calling is tested before it is trusted. Joseph was given dreams, but before the fulfillment came, the pit, betrayal, false accusation, and prison. David was anointed king, but then chased, threatened, and hidden. Jesus himself was led into the wilderness after baptism. God allows pressure because pressure exposes what faith alone cannot reveal. Pressure reveals character. It exposes fear, pride, insecurity, and dependence. Under pressure, what is truly inside begins to surface. That is why God does not remove it too quickly. He is not interested in appearances. He is interested in formation. Pressure teaches you to pray when strength runs out. It teaches you obedience when emotions resist. It teaches you trust when answers delay. Many believers assume pressure means opposition, but Scripture often shows pressure as confirmation. The enemy resists what God intends to use. Resistance increases when purpose is present. God does not waste suffering. He redeems it. He uses pressure to deepen roots so future fruit can survive storms. Under pressure, God teaches you who you are in Him. Not when things go well, but when everything feels uncertain. Pressure strips away false confidence and replaces it with spiritual authority. It transforms calling from idea to reality. If life feels heavier since you sense God's hand on you, do not assume you missed Him. Pressure may be revealing the strength He already placed inside you. Number 3, God changes how you see yourself and the world. When God chooses you, one of the most profound changes happens quietly on the inside. Before your circumstances shift, before your calling becomes visible, God begins reshaping how you see yourself and how you interpret the world around you. Old definitions no longer fit. The way you once measured success, identity, and worth starts to feel shallow. God is not just preparing your future, He is renewing your mind. Scripture shows us that calling always begins with a shift in perspective. Gideon saw himself as weak and insignificant, but God addressed him as a mighty warrior. Peter saw himself as unstable, impulsive, yet Jesus called him a rock. Paul once saw righteousness through performance, but after encountering Christ, he saw everything through grace. God's choosing redefines His identity before it redirects activity. This internal change can feel disorienting. You may begin questioning beliefs you once held without reflection. You may feel tension between who you were trained to be and who God is revealing you to be. Comforting illusions fall away. Self-reliance weakens. Pride is confronted, but in its place, clarity begins to form. Not always about what you will do, but about who you belong to. God changes how you see the world as well. What once excited you may no longer satisfy you. What once felt urgent may lose its urgency. You begin noticing spiritual realities you once ignored. Compassion deepens, discernment sharpens, sin feels heavier, obedience feels more personal. God is tuning your vision so you can perceive life through His truth, not your emotions or culture. This transformation is not instant. It unfolds gradually as truth replaces lies. God exposes false identities built on comparison, performance, or approval, and replaces them with identity rooted in sonship and purpose. The more God reveals who you are in Him, the harder it becomes to live beneath that truth. If you feel like you don't quite fit where you used to, if your inner world feels altered, do not resist it. God is not confusing you, He is clarifying you. When He chooses someone, He gives them new eyes, and with those eyes comes responsibility, discernment, and deeper alignment with His will. Number 4, God trains you in hidden places before public purpose. One of the most difficult realities of being chosen by God is that the training often happens where no one sees. Long before God entrusts public influence, He develops private faithfulness. The Bible is clear. God values what happens in secret more than what happens on display. Hidden seasons are not delays, they are classrooms. David learned leadership while guarding sheep, not while wearing a crown. Joseph learned integrity while serving in prison, not while standing in authority. Moses learned humility while tending sheep, not while confronting Pharaoh. Even Jesus spent 30 years in obscurity before 3 years of public ministry. God is never in a hurry to reveal what He has not yet refined. Hidden seasons test motives. He reveals whether obedience is rooted in love or recognition. When no one is watching, excuses lose their power. Faithfulness becomes real. God watches how you steward time, respond to correction, handle disappointment, and serve without applause. These moments shape capacity far more than visible success ever could. This season can feel frustrating. You may feel forgotten, stagnant, or overlooked. You may wonder why God hasn't opened doors that seem obvious. But Scripture shows that God withholds public purpose until private character can sustain it. What looks like an activity is often intense preparation. Hidden training builds endurance. It deepens intimacy with God. It removes dependency on validation. God teaches you to obey because He is worthy, not because it is rewarding. This kind of obedience cannot be faked and it cannot be rushed. If you are faithful in obscurity, God remembers. He records every act of obedience that others never notice. And when the time comes, He reveals what He prepared, not what you promoted. Being chosen by God means trusting Him with timing as much as with calling. If your life feels quiet, unseen, or slow, take heart. God does some of His deepest work where the world isn't looking. Number 5, God demands deeper obedience and trust. When God chooses you, obedience is no longer optional or casual. It becomes deeply personal. What once felt like general instruction now feels like a direct invitation. God begins to ask for things that stretch you, not because He wants to burden you, but because He wants to deepen your trust. Being chosen brings you into a closer partnership with God, and partnership always requires surrender. In Scripture, those God chose were asked to obey in ways that didn't always make sense. Noah built an ark when rain had never fallen. Abraham left familiarity without knowing the destination. Mary said yes to a calling that could have cost her reputation, safety, and future. Obedience for the chosen is rarely convenient, but it is always purposeful. God is not testing your ability, He is shaping your dependence. Deeper obedience often exposes fear. You begin to realize how much you like control, certainty, and comfort. God's instructions may challenge your logic, your timing, or your sense of security. And in those moments, obedience becomes an act of trust. You obey not because you understand everything, but because you trust the one who speaks. This kind of obedience refines the heart. It reveals idols you didn't know you had. It confronts hesitation. It forces you to choose between faith and familiarity. God does not demand obedience to restrict you. He demands it to free you from lesser attachments. Every step of obedience loosens the grip of fear and strengthens spiritual authority. God's chosen ones are not perfect, but they are responsive. They may question, but they ultimately yield. Obedience trains the soul to recognize God's voice and respond quickly. Over time, trust grows, not because circumstances improve, but because intimacy deepens. If God has been asking you to obey in ways that feel uncomfortable, specific, or costly, do not assume you are being punished. You may be being trusted. God only asks for deeper obedience from those He is drawing closer. And every act of obedience positions you to see His faithfulness in ways comfort never could. Number 6, God uses your weakness to display His power. One of the most humbling truths about being chosen by God is this: He does not remove all your weaknesses. He often highlights them not to shame you, but to ensure that the glory belongs to Him. God has never depended on human strength to accomplish divine purpose. In fact, Scripture shows that weakness is often the very place where God's power is most clearly revealed. Moses struggled with speech. Paul wrestled with a thorn he begged God to remove. The disciples were inconsistent, fearful, and slow to understand. Yet God chose them not in spite of their weakness, but through it. Weakness keeps you dependent. It reminds you that the work is God's, not yours. It keeps pride from taking root and grace from being forgotten. When God chooses you, He allows you to feel your limitations so you don't confuse calling with capability. He wants you aware of your need for Him. Self-sufficiency weakens spiritual authority, but dependence strengthens it. God's power flows most freely through lives that acknowledge their limits. This can feel uncomfortable because weakness contradicts how the world defines success. You may wish you were more confident, more gifted, more composed, but God sees weakness as an opening, not an obstacle. It creates space for His strength to be visible. When God works through your weakness, no one mistakes the source of the outcome. Scripture teaches that God's grace is sufficient. Not after weakness is removed, but while it remains, He meets you there. He sustains you there. He displays His faithfulness there. And through that process, your weakness becomes testimony. If you've been frustrated by what you lack, pause and reconsider. That very weakness may be the place God intends to reveal His power most clearly. Being chosen does not mean being strong. It means being surrendered. And surrendered lives make room for God to do what human strength never could. Number 7, God sends you for the sake of others, not just yourself. One of the clearest signs that God has chosen you is that your life begins to matter beyond you. Calling is never self-contained. When God chooses someone, He does not simply bless them for personal fulfillment. He entrusts them with responsibility for others. Scripture shows us that God's choosing always carries an outward direction. He forms you inwardly so He can send you outwardly. Esther was chosen not for comfort but for courage to stand in the gap for people who could not save themselves. Isaiah was cleansed and then sent. The disciples were transformed and then commissioned. God's choosing is never an end point. It is a starting line. It awakens compassion, responsibility, and holy urgency. You begin to feel the weight of lives beyond your own. This can feel overwhelming. You may feel inadequate, unqualified, or unsure of how God could use you to impact anyone else. But God does not wait for confidence. He builds it through obedience. He sends people while they are still learning because dependence keeps the mission anchored in Him. When God sends you, He supplies what you lack along the way. Being sent does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like loving consistently, speaking truth gently, praying faithfully, showing up when it would be easier to withdraw. God's sending is often quiet but deeply powerful. Lives are shaped not only by sermons, but by presence, integrity, and compassion lived out over time. When God looks at you, He sees potential influence not in numbers, but in faithfulness. He sees how your obedience can become someone else's breakthrough. Your healing can bring hope. Your testimony can bring courage. Your faith can spark life in places you never expected. If you've sensed a growing concern for others, a burden that won't leave, or a call to step beyond comfort, that may not be pressure, it may be purpose. God chooses people so they can become conduits of grace. And when He sends you, He goes with you. Being chosen means your life becomes a blessing in motion. Not perfect, not polished, but surrendered. And surrendered. Lives change more than they realize. Conclusion. When God chooses you, everything changes. Being chosen by God is not about status. It is about transformation. It changes how you live, how you trust, how you obey, and how you love. As you've seen, when God chooses someone, separation begins, pressure increases, identity shifts, hidden training deepens. Obedience becomes personal. Weakness becomes a doorway for power, and purpose extends beyond the self if you recognize these patterns in your life. Take heart. Confusion does not mean you missed God. Pressure does not mean you failed. Delay does not mean you were forgotten. Often these are signs that God is working more deeply than you can see. He is forming something eternal, not temporary. He is preparing you, not punishing you. God's choosing is not a label you wear. It is a journey you walk. And every step of that journey requires trust. Trust when you are separated. Trust when you are tested. Trust when you are unseen. Trust when you feel weak. Trust when obedience costs more than you expected. Trust when purpose feels heavier than comfort. If this message stirs something in your heart, don't ignore it. Let it move you closer to God, not into fear. Respond with surrender, not comparison. Ask God what He is inviting you into right now. And listen, He is faithful to guide those He calls. If this message encouraged you, like this video so it can reach others who may be walking through the same season. Leave a comment sharing which part resonated most with you or where you feel God is working in your life right now. And if you want more messages like this rooted in scripture and spoken to the heart, subscribe to the channel and stay connected. God does not choose lightly. And if He has chosen you, it means He intends to finish what He started. Trust the process. Walk forward in faith and remember what God begins, He completes.